So here are some of the influences on Michelangelo. I wish we could go in. All of these are separate stories that are just profound stories. But there was a man by the name of Marsilio Ficino, who was a Neoplatonist and a philosopher who really influenced Michelangelo. There was Savonarola, we're going to look at in just a minute, and Vittoria Colonna, the woman who brought Michelangelo to faith, and the Viterbo circle. Viterbo is a town in central Italy, and these people from that town had a profound effect on Michelangelo. And they introduced him to Martin Luther's writings and the Protestant Reformation, things that were happening with the Protestant Reformation. So in reviewing, reimagining the faith through the arts and architecture, that's what this is all about, reimagining our faith through the arts and architecture, which we could choose any century, but we're talking about the high Renaissance, the high Renaissance. So let me just tell you what this, as you're looking at that, let me just tell you what this, what it's like during this period of time. Try to wrap your mind around this. This is the high Renaissance. Now, my professors said high Renaissance. I always said Renaissance, so I might switch back and forth between Renaissance and Renaissance because I'm confused. Aren't we all? This is the high Renaissance in Italy. It's the time of Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. The world, the new world, is being discovered. Science will explode with discoveries. Cosmology will shift from a geocentric system to a solar system, the way we view the outside space. The arts will change dramatically. Humanism will grow. Morals will shift. Religion will change. And nations, whole nations, will leave the control of the Roman Catholic Church. The church will be deconstructed. I mean, the only church in town was the Roman Catholic Church. Roman Catholic Church will be deconstructed and reconstructed. It's a time of tremendous upheaval. Fashion will change. Money will change. Just one aside. We call Florence, Florence, when its actual name is Firenze. And the people who live in Firenze say, why do you call it Florence? We call it Florence because of the Italian florin. That's a monetary measurement, which is like the American dollar. It would be like America in 200 years being called the buck. You know, why do you call it the buck when it's, America? Anyway, so that's Florence is changing. Money is changing. Careers are changing. People are leaving what was known as, membership to a particular kind of guild, and they're developing their own individual careers. Travel is changing. People are traveling internationally much more easily, and of course, trade is changing. And this will transform and expand and diversify all these nations which are beginning to meld together. Education will expand. Women will begin to be more greatly included in society. Architecture will take on a more human scale, and the Gothic style that we looked at a couple of weeks ago will not be the only kind of sacred spaces being built. Italian architecture, that was my focus of study at Oxford, was the Italian Renaissance, the Italian architecture, and the Reformation, which are happening at the same time. So architecture is changing dramatically in Italy during this time. Islam is a growing power, and it's not stopped. The advance of Islam from the East is not stopped until it reaches the gates of Vienna in the 16th century. Imagine that. For centuries, it just keeps marching across. And the kind of upheaval that's happened in the Balkan states and those kinds of things, that's the same war. It never came to an end. So remember the stuff with Serbia and all of that? That's the same war. So this is the kind of stuff that they're facing in the middle, in the 1500s. Armies, massive armies are on the march. Rome itself, we'll talk about it in a little bit, Rome itself is sacked. The center of Roman Catholicism is sacked by Protestant soldiers. Did you know that? That's crazy stuff. Shakespeare, this is the time of Shakespeare. Henry VIII, Martin Luther, John Calvin, and all of these people will appear on the world stage at once. And the world will change. I am blown away by the level of genius and the level of invention and of science and of innovation and imagination. And how did this happen? It happened because these people believed a biblical truth. The truth they believed was that human beings were created in the image and likeness of God. And if that's true, and God is so magnificent, what must be inside human beings? And they began to look at that, and they began to experiment, and they lost some of their inhibition, some of which they should have kept, but some of it really moved them forward. So we've talked about Giotto, who made them a move towards depicting figures naturalistically in naturalism. And he got the attention of the whole world. Abbot Suger, who invented the Gothic style and created a new sense of place and sacred spaces, which has inspired the imagination of millions of worshipers for 1,000 years. This is real influence we're talking about. Masaccio, we talked about last week, who uses science and math to depict linear perspective for the first time and evoked compelling emotions in those who saw his works, the Holy Trinity in fresco that we talked about last week in Santa Maria Novella. This was an event that when that fresco was unveiled, people lined up for blocks and they would stand in front of that fresco and weep because they'd never seen anything like it before. Real people in real space being depicted. That was just not possible before. And it demonstrates the importance of sincere, heartfelt emotion and how important it is to vital to worship. Not emotionalism. Emotionalism is like overreaction to insufficient stimuli. That's actually a definition. Not emotionalism per se, nor passionless dogma from the church, but something that people could actually experience. And this was the whole bend of all of this. People needed, wanted, desired, and created new experiences intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, personally, theologically. Amazing. So today we talk about Michelangelo's influence on this period of time, and that he influenced the way people conceive of theological narratives. We talked about this a few weeks ago in May about how what he is depicting and portraying has deep theological importance, with a cohesive vision of the rich theology of biblical stories. His journey to faith was deeply thought out. This was a guy who could think. He could also punch you in the face, but he was not always a nice guy. But he thought about his faith, and he thought about it very deeply and profoundly expressed his theological ideas through the things that he created. In fact, he said, if you're going to criticize by what you create. I like that. Criticize by what you create. You can tear something down, but why don't you build something up and let people compare your ideas against their ideas. And that might be helpful. He actually did that. He invented new images and expressed new ideas that provided an enduring catechism for generations to come. His work was catechetical. He was teaching all the time with the work that he was doing. We look at it and we go, oh, Renaissance painting. And, yeah, but it's also catechism. He was passing the faith down to future generations. That's the question we have today. How do we pass our faith down to the next generation? He teaches us that art continues to speak in ecclesial forms and outdated language when outdated language is no longer useful. Example, the visual language of our culture today is a strong indicator of this very phenomenon. In fact, the top-selling movies around the world are not documentaries, but they're all based on epic tales of fiction and graphic knowledge, from The Lord of the Rings to Iron Man. These are the stories that make the mega millions, and we're really talking about billions of dollars. These are the stories. So what can we learn from this? How are we going to apply these things to our own understanding? So it's the title here, The Ending of the World. This is the time in which Michelangelo lived. He lived at a time that really was regarded by many as the ending of the world. Well, the ending of the world is also the beginning of another world, and that's exactly right. Michelangelo was a student of Marsilio Ficino, who was a Neoplatonist. He was a follower of Savonarola, kind of at a distance. His dearest friend was Vittoria Colonna. He created art for 9 different popes. Think about that. He was no Johnny-come-lately. He had an enduring command in the Vatican. He died at 89. He outlived all his contemporaries and all his detractors. He just outlived them. There's a saying that says, if you sit on the bank of the river long enough, you'll watch your enemy's body float by. That describes Michelangelo. He just sat on the bank long enough. There's another person, Girolamo Savonarola. He was a friar and a preacher and a prophet and a reformer and a proto-Protestant. He died in 1498. A sad story. We'll talk about it in a minute. But he was preaching justification by faith before Martin Luther was preaching justification by faith. And he had a profound effect on the world. He was publicly executed along with 2 of his disciples. He was hanged and then burned. And then his ashes were swept up and thrown in the Arno River 1 block away, so that there would be no memory of him left. That's how charming he was. That's how much Rome liked him. But you can go today in the Piazza del Signoria and stand on the big circular brass plaque that's located set in the ground, in the pavement, that marks the spot where Savonarola was martyred. You can't forget a guy like this. Then there's Vittoria Colonna. She's from an aristocratic family. She's a Marchioness. She had a military husband who died before her, so she's a widow. She's a poetess. She's a reformer. She's a Protestant reformer in the Vatican. She and the Viterbo circle yearned for a reformation and regeneration from within the Catholic Church. She never left the Catholic Church, nor did Michelangelo, nor did many of the people who believed what Luther was saying. They stayed in the Catholic Church. And today, the influence, I would say, if you look at the Roman Catholic Church in America and compare it to someplace like the Roman Catholic Church in Haiti, I've seen that. I've been there. I know what that's about. Very different worlds. Not the same church, even. The Roman Catholic Church in the West, in America, and Western Europe is very greatly influenced by the Protestant Reformation. And it's not what it was during the Renaissance. So in Michelangelo's early years, from 14 onward, he was with masters, Dominican Ghirlandaio, Bertolo di Giovanni, and Poliziano, and he spent years with the Medici. He studied philosophy under Marsilio Ficino, the humanist and the Neoplatonist. He had his nose broken because he mocked one of his fellow students' artwork, and he became so angry he punched him in the nose, nearly killed him, broke his nose, and his nose was bent for the rest of his life. So he could be quite, what's the word, acidic in the things that he said. One artist during Michelangelo's life had created, in Florence, had created a statue of Neptune, and his name was Ammannati, and Ammannati wanted Michelangelo to see the statue that he'd created. And so Ammannati says to Michelangelo, he's standing in front of this large statue of Neptune, which is almost as large as the statue of David. And he says, well, so what do you think? And Michelangelo says, Ammannati, what a fine marble you have ruined. Oh, he could be very cutting. He studied and copied the classical forms of Greek and Roman sculpture. And at the same time he was growing up, this was the discovery of the New World, and new sciences were emerging. He was between 17 and 20 years old when Columbus discovered the Americas. And you can imagine that. You know what that's like? That's like being alive when someone lands on another planet and discovers life on another planet. It was that dramatic. Then he encountered this guy named Savonarola when he's a young man. Savonarola achieved a kind of celebrity status. He was, this was the end of the 1400s. There was a lot of angst about what the 1500s would bring. It was kind of like the Y2K. I got that back where I put YK2, but it's Y2K, right? So that's how much I paid attention to that silly stuff. But anyway, but it was like that, as the end of the world is coming. It was that kind of world. Everyone knew the Middle Ages was over, but no one knew what would follow. He was a timid friar in the beginning and a poor preacher. And people talk about it, what a bad preacher he was in the beginning. But he grew into an emotional preacher. He was popular. He had a huge following. His sermons were sin-centered and with guilt and shame and judgment and destruction. And he also was a proto-Protestant in his ideas. He attracted Renaissance artists. There were artists like Botticelli. Birth of Venus. You know this painting, Birth of Venus. Botticelli followed him. And so did Michelangelo. Botticelli's brother followed him. And so did Michelangelo, and other, Bertolo and other artists followed him, were part of his church. The problems that he preached hell, fire, and brimstone all the time. He was preaching an apocalyptic end of the world and the coming of God's kingdom. He preached holiness and separation from the world. He preached against the problems with the Muslims, and he discovered, and the discoveries of the New World and the new sciences were off-putting to him. It destabilized him. And he's full of conflicts in politics. He's very political. I mean, he would be right at home in America today. He had both feet in the middle of politics. And he was a prophet. He would prophesy things that were just outrageous that would come to pass. And when France came down to attack Florence, they also attacked Rome. When they came down to attack Florence, they sent Savonarola out to talk to King Charles V, to broker a deal between Florence and France. That's the kind of influence, political influence he had. He divided Florence into camps. I can't tell you what these names are in Italian, but the two camps were the outraged, because they were outraged at what Savonarola was doing. And the other camp was called the Snivelers. And you know why they were snivelers? Because they were so emotional. They start talking about Jesus and they just get so snivelly. And the outrage were like, oh, for crying out loud, get a hold of yourself. But they really were separated like this. And then he does this, what we still talk about today. He created the bonfire of the vanities when he whipped his followers and all of Florence into this frenzy over purging themselves of sinful objects like mirrors and makeup and paintings, sexy paintings. You think pornography is a problem only in this age? Pornography is always a problem. You know why? It's because people want to satisfy their sexual curiosity, which never has worked, by the way. So they bring out all of their wonderful, beautiful, jewelry and costumes and fashion, and they put it in a big pile in the piazza, and they set it on, burn it. They burn it. I mean, and people are going, yikes! I mean, we're talking about Renaissance paintings. We're talking about all kinds of wealth beyond imagining. And they just destroyed it. Just they sent it to God in a burnt offering. Up it went. And people, even today, are still outraged that he would do stuff like this. And I'll tell you what, I still hear preachers talking about doing stuff like that. This comes from Savonarola. This is the kind of influence he had there. He resisted the Pope. The Pope, when the Pope had it. And the Pope said, we're not really talking about a godly Pope here. We're just talking about a secular Pope. But the Pope says, I want you to come to talk to me in Rome. It's like being called to the principal's office for a paddling, but there's usually not a paddle, more like a mace or something like that, hatchet or something like that. So Savonarola defied him and said no. And the Pope sent an envoy to Florence and said, now we're going to have a real conversation. He resisted the Pope. He was arrested. He was hung and burned, and his ashes were dumped in the Arno River in 1498. And today, that bronze plaque stands on that spot where he died. Here's what happened. I mean, if you read the story of Savonarola, and you read how horrendously this poor man was tortured, and his disciples before he was murdered, he said nothing for a long time, but just before he was executed, he said to the Pope, this is not over. This is not over. And within 19 years, the Protestant Reformation began, and Rome was sacked. Rome itself was sacked in 1527. What Savonarola was doing in a prophetic way, he was stumbling around in the dark, as it were, trying to decide what was actually happening in the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era that we know about. He was trying to discern, trying to understand what was happening. But in the midst of it, he understood that a wave had been generated theologically. Things had begun that could not be reversed. So Michelangelo began his career after Savonarola was martyred. And here's just a timeline of the things that happened, just a highlight of the timelines that happened. You can go online and find a lot of those kinds of things. But enter Vittoria Colonna in 1536. This is 25 years after the Sistine Chapel painting. There was a new pope, Paul III, in the Vatican. He hadn't been there since 1512, and now it's 1536. Since last he was in Rome, the Protestant Reformation had begun. Rome had been sacked by Charles V and the Protestant soldiers. This is where Michelangelo and Vittoria Colonna become close. He'd probably known of her before, but they become fast friends. She introduces him to the Viterbo circle, friends from Viterbo, meeting in Rome to study the scriptures and the writings of Martin Luther as well as other reformers. Some of that group, some of the Viterbo circle were martyred for their faith. And Vittoria Colonna is regarded as suspicious and could even have been dangerous to be associated with. She remains in a convent, writing about her deceased husband and creating poetical works, but promoting spiritual renewal in the Catholic Church and impressing on Michelangelo his spiritual needs. She's on fire. This woman is on fire for God. And when Michelangelo was finished with the Last Judgment, which she helped him with, she helped him. Christ had no beard, the saints had no clothes, and the angels had no wings. So says National Geographic. Michelangelo consults with Vittoria. Rarely did he ever consult with anyone. His early drawings show Mary's face turned toward Christ. We'll see this in a minute. Vittoria is displeased by his depiction of Mary turned towards Christ when he's judging humankind. Namely, she has some sway with Christ in the, as if Mary has some kind of sway with Christ in the hour of his judgment. This, Colonna insists, cannot be. You cannot say this in your painting. Christ alone is the judge, even the judge of his own mother. Think about this. Christ will be the judge, the final judge. And Vittoria impresses on Michelangelo that he must not show the Holy Mother as an object of worship, but to honor her without venerating her. So she didn't want her disgraced. I think it's wise what she said. She directs him to make Christ the center, the only advocate and mediator between God and humankind. And this he does. These drawings were shown at the Seattle Art Museum. I saw them in 2009. Look at this highlighted section here. The primary focus of this exhibit of Michelangelo's primary work for the Sistine Chapel in Rome includes a selection of working drawings for the Sistine Chapel and the Last Judgment. Together, these objects give modern viewers insight into the artist's working process, from sketches to finished studies. This exposure would have appalled Michelangelo, who burned many of his drawings at the end of his life, hoping to sustain the idea that divine inspiration, not human labor, was responsible for his celebrated manuscripts. And that last sentence is inaccurate, but even curators make mistakes. I saw these drawings, and you can see the evolution of the way Michelangelo portrays Mary in the Last Judgment. Now, I'm not going to read that. If you want to take a screenshot of that so that you have something to read later, that would be fine. But here's two. That would be good. The two works are together: the ceiling and the altar wall. This ceiling was begun and finished in 1508 and 12, and the altar wall 1536 and 1541. Here's the composition of the wall. Remember, we've been discussing the matter of depicting real people in real space. Remember this conversation? By the time we get to Michelangelo's later works, we not only see real people and their placement in space, but we see them liberated from gravity and flying around in the air. It's really dramatic. This continues into the Baroque era. The reaction at the unveiling of the altar wall. Connie, could you do me a favor? In the right-hand front pocket on the green bag, there is clipped to the side of right there. There you go. You know what was happening. Okay, so lasers in the jungle. So we thank you. The Pope Paul saw the completed work. When he saw it, he fell on his knees and exclaimed that he was a sinner and pled for Christ's forgiveness. Why? Because he saw the skull. Do you see the skull? Do you see it now? Do you see it? Hidden in this massive painting is a gargantuan skull grimacing at you. You are mortal. You will die. Prepare for that moment. So here we see the central figure, Christ, and Mary. Mary's form is twisted. I want you to try something. I want you to assume this pose. Turn your body one way. Turn your shoulders and your head another way. And I want you to put your hands in the same position hers are in. Okay. Some people are going, I can't do that. Her body, now we'll begin our aerobic session. Thank you. Her body is turned toward Christ, but she turns her face away from him in this moment of judgment. She cannot look upon him in this hour. Look at this. She's not looking up, she's looking down. This is not a prayer form. This is a exclamatory form. Her hands are not in a prayer pose, they are crossed in apprehension. She sits beside him, but she knows that he is her judge too. All of these things have been written by numerous authors through the years. I'm not making this up, is what I'm trying to say. I'm not making this up. Authors through the years, from Vasari to today, people continued to unpack the meaning hidden in this massive composition. This is the resurrection of all. Now, I don't know where your theology is on this, but Michelangelo is going to school us. Notice how Christ rises from his throne. He is depicted as a Herculean figure. He is the divine Hercules in power. He is youthful and vibrant and full of energy. With his right hand, he summons the righteous to heaven, and angels lovingly lift them into his safety. With his left hand, he sends the wicked away, and demons drag them into the underworld. And yet, he doesn't look angry. He's not grimacing. He is stern, but he is self-possessed, if you understand what I'm saying. He is almost dispassionate. What an image. This is one of my favorite images. Heaven and hell is what he's saying. There is nothing in between. Historical Christian thinking is quite binary on many points, which is not popular today. There are not many heavens, just one. The Christian heaven is not a place of eternal bliss for all the departed, like some happy hunting ground. And I hear reporters even ask Christians, Christian ministers, do you think that this group of people or that group of people will actually go to heaven? And Christians sputter and don't know what to say. I know what to say. Here's the question. What heaven are you talking about? Because I don't think you and I are talking about the same thing when we're talking. What is the Christian heaven? What is the heaven Christians are going to? Christians are going to go to the place where Jesus Christ sits on the throne. And all of heaven and all the world is subject to his will. He is the Lord who will be worshipped for eternity. He is the light of the new city. He is the temple of heaven. Is that the heaven you want to go to? And most people will say, well, no. It's like, well, then you probably won't. That's where we want to go. That's what this means. In the place where Christ alone is king and the will of God is done without diminishment or resistance. Hell is depicted as the place for demons and fallen angels. The devil or Satan is not specifically shown, but demons and the fallen are depicted. The place of righteousness is with Christ himself and nothing less. Angels blow the trumpets, indicating the end of all things has come. Peter displays the keys that Christ gave him. But his face, look at his face. His face and the faces of the saints around him, these are not happy faces. This is not a party. They are full of consternation and apprehension because they know it's not by their own righteousness that they are saved, but by the grace of Christ alone. And this is the doctrine of the Reformation. Faith alone, grace alone, Christ alone, Scripture alone. This is the doctrine of Luther, Calvin, and the Protestant reformers, as well as of Vittoria Colonna and Michelangelo himself. This is the time when all the pieces come together for the great artist, and all of it is seen here on the altar wall. Martyred saints show how they are tortured for their faith. And this is Michelangelo's self-portrait. I deserve that, is what he said. He also is saying, I'm willing for that. The cross of Christ and his crown of thorns are lovingly carried into heaven itself. The post at which Christ was flogged is lifted into the heavens in honor. By his stripes you have been healed. Others have shared in Christ's sufferings, and they show the instruments of their torture and death. Over 300 figures are depicted here, moving in space, some up, some down. And you can see, even here, demons are still trying to keep the angels from pulling the righteous into heaven. There's this battle that's going on, and this level right here is where the conflict is the hottest and the most dramatic. The dead come back to life and re-inhabit their previous bodies, which will be physically resurrected and glorified in heaven, just as Christ's body was and is now. 1 Corinthians 15. The condemned are dragged into hell by demons. This reminds us of Dante's writings, one of Michelangelo's favorite authors. One of the most terrifying images in the painting is this poor creature here. The look of despair and utter hopelessness can be seen on this face. It reminds me of Lewis's Screwtape Letters, where the demons talk about eating, devouring human beings. I wonder if Lewis was referencing something like this. Here, Charon drives the damned from the boat into hell. But Michelangelo is not without a wry sense of humor. Here's a man named Biagio. He was the MC for the Vatican, and he disliked the nude figures. He said, those figures in the Sistine Chapel are fit for a brothel and nothing less. And he went and he complained to the Pope. And the Pope says, what's your problem? He said, well, Michelangelo he's put me in hell. Because they were in this argument about the nude figures. Michelangelo has painted me in hell. Oh yeah, what? He said, well, he's given me the ears of Minos, and he put a big snake wrapped around me, biting me on my penis. True story. And he said, well, where is the figure located in the painting? Well, it's right there in hell. He said, you've got to tell him to get me out of hell. And the Pope said, I'm sorry, I don't have any jurisdiction in hell. That's a great story. So don't mess with an artist. They have the power to put you in hell. So Michelangelo loved this woman. I've got to really move here fast. He asked her to marry him, but she refused, probably because she was dedicated to holding up the memory of her husband, probably because she was dedicated to the convent and her monastic life, probably because she was not sure Michelangelo was an authentic Christian, probably because he was so unique and attached to the papacy, and he knew all of this theology, and so he could talk theology till the cows came home. But she didn't know if that meant he was Christian or not. She may have felt he needed to come farther away in his heart from the Vatican. He was dependent on it for his sustenance and fame, and the fame that it gave him. Though he was fairly wealthy man by then, he still depended on the Vatican. She may have felt him still too proud and maybe too worldly, too capable in his own powers, maybe. So in the Pauline, after the wall is done, Pope Paul asks him to paint 2 paintings in the Pauline chapel, which he does. And so he paints a picture of St. Paul being converted on the road to Damascus. Christ has a more traditional look here. He's not like in the Last Judgment. He has his beard back, but his hair is blonde because Italians like blonde hair. And this is the self-portrait. He knew full well that Saul was a young man at the time of his conversion, but he portrayed himself as having had a Damascus Road experience for the sake of convincing Vittoria Colonna that his conversion was authentic. This is a self-portrait. This is his self-portrait. That happened to me. That's what he's telling her. This is maybe another self-portrait in the same painting. Here is the Peter's crucifixion, and this is also a self-portrait. So he is saying, I have had that kind of experience, and I am willing to be crucified for my Lord, upside down. He was trying to tell her how committed he was to Christ. When Vittoria Colonna dies in 1547, he is inconsolable. He loved her so much. And he wept and he grieved for her. And we need to finish. I'll just finish with these 3 readings. He writes this after her death. When the prime mover of many sighs, heaven took through death from out her earthly place, nature, that never made so fair a face, remained ashamed, and tears were in all eyes. O fate, unheeding my impassioned cries, O hopes fallacious, O thou spirit of grace, where art thou now? Earth holds in its embrace thy lovely limbs, thy holy thoughts, the skies. Vainly did cruel death attempt to stay the rumor of thy virtuous renown. That Lethe's waters could not wash away, 1,000 leaves since he hath stricken thee down. Speak of thee, not to thee could heaven convey, except through death, a refuge and a crown. To the Creator. The prayers I make will then be sweet indeed, if thou the Spirit give by which I pray. My unassisted heart is barren clay, which of its native self can nothing feed. Of good and pious works thou art the seed, which quickens only where thou sayest it may, unless thou show to us thine own true way. No man can find it, Father, thou must lead. Do thou then breathe those thoughts into my mind, by which such virtue may be in me bred, that in thy holy footsteps I may tread. The fetters of my tongue do thou unbind, that I may have the power to sing of thee, and sound thy praises everlastingly. The last one is called Mea culpa, my sin. Now hath my life across a stormy sea, like a frail bark, reached that wide port where all are bidden, ere the final reckoning fall of good and evil for eternity. Now know I well how that fond fantasy which made my soul the worshipper and thrall of earthly art is vain. How criminal is that which all men seek unwillingly, those amorous thoughts which were so lightly dressed. What are they when the double death is nigh? The one I know for sure, the other dread. Painting nor sculpture now can lull to rest my soul that turns to his great love on high, whose arms to clasp us on the cross were spread. So you tell me, did he come to know Christ or not? I think he knew Christ better than I. And with that, we'll close. Thank you for your attention and attending this class. God bless you. Well, do keep CAM in your prayers, please. What we're doing with Cathedral Arts Ministries, we are your missionaries to the ever-changing culture, and we are well prepared for such things, especially if God anoint us and help us. And if your prayers are sent heavenward, we will certainly benefit from that. And so will you, and so will Christ's church. So God bless you.